Sarah Mitchell stepped off the transport van into a wall of dry desert air and silence so absolute it swallowed the sound of her boots. The entrance to Falcon Crest Command Base stood behind a gate of reinforced steel, framed by perimeter towers and concrete walls that shimmered faintly in the heat. She adjusted the strap on her duffel and moved forward without hesitation, her grey logistics uniform clinging to her in the sun. It bore no patches, no rank, no nameplate, just standard civilian issue. She carried no orders in hand, only a digital authorization embedded in her ID chip, which the scanner at the gate read with a reluctant beep. Inside, everything looked ordered and untouchable. Rows of sleek simulator hangars, personnel impressed, flight suits moving with practiced speed, and command officers whose glances swept past her as if she were part of the equipment. A tall man in a pilot instructor vest passed her near the intake office and barked, "Civilian manifest drop-off is down the hall. Logistics doesn't loiter near the flight rings." Sarah nodded, said nothing, and moved on. She wasn't there to loiter. She had been mistakenly routed to Falcon Crest due to an internal systems reassignment error, something she quietly suspected but chose not to challenge. Not yet. She wanted to see what this place truly was. The next morning, during the trainee briefing, she stood near the back wall of the flight operations bay. Screens lit up with simulations of multi-engine descent control and lateral drift recovery, most of which she already understood. Her hand rose once when the instructor asked about emergency cargo load shifting in asymmetric turbulence. She barely finished her sentence before the front row erupted in laughter. One cadet grinned and muttered, "She thinks she's here to brief pilots." The instructor gave her a hard look and continued without acknowledging her question. A few heads turned toward her, eyes narrowed, skeptical or amused. Later that day, as she passed through the main simulator hallway, a cluster of cadets in navy blue suits blocked her path. At their center was Derek Ryan, whose name was whispered often with envy. He was the son of a decorated colonel and carried himself with the unearned confidence of someone raised inside a cockpit. Without warning, he tipped the contents of his electrolyte bottle across her lap, bright blue liquid soaking into the front of her uniform. "You'll get used to mopping up after real pilots," he said with a smirk. Phones were out before she could step away, screens flickering as some captured her silence, waiting for an outburst that never came. She looked down at the spreading stain on her uniform and made no move to wipe it off. The liquid clung bright against the dull grey fabric, a mark that might as well have said outsider. Her expression didn't change. She walked past him, her posture level. The laughter behind her followed, then faded. By the end of the week, it was made official. Sarah received an internal memo stating that due to her civilian logistics classification, she would not be granted access to flight simulation systems. Instead, she was assigned to manage manifest documentation and assist with parts routing. When she reported to the training hangar, the doors to the simulators remained locked to her. ID instructors barely acknowledged her presence. During a training exercise review, she stood behind a tinted glass panel while cadets practiced storm descent protocols inside full-scale mock-ups. She watched closely, noting how one trainee overcorrected rudder trim and failed the exercise. No, one asked her opinion. At meals, she sat alone, her tray always neat, went mostly untouched. Conversations at the surrounding tables buzzed with coded arrogance. "Heard she's a misfile from drone tech," someone said. "Maybe she thinks she's here to pilot forklifts," the same voice added. "Or maybe she's auditing our swagger." Every comment landed within earshot, but none drew a response. Her focus stayed on a small, spiral-bound notebook that never left her side. In it, she jotted patterns from simulator logs, altitude thresholds, fuel load calculations. No one asked what she was writing. Her uniform never changed. The same grey, same lack of insignia, same stain where the electrolyte had dried and left. A faded mark. It became a symbol to them of what she wasn't. To her, it was something else, armor they didn't understand. The more they overlooked her, the more she saw. Every system, every personnel handoff, every shortcut used by trainees who assumed no one beneath their rank paid attention. One afternoon, as the cadets gathered for a tactical group photo in front of the base's central simulator dome, she was told to step aside. "We're capturing aviators, not admin," Derek said with a laugh. She stood just outside the frame, facing away from the camera, letting the desert wind tug her braid over one shoulder. She didn't flinch, didn't speak, and didn't step closer. What she did do, quietly and with precision, was observe. The cadence of the base, the structure of their routines, the flaws they never noticed. Sarah's days began before sunrise and ended long after the tarmac cooled. She worked in silence, moving from hangar to hangar with a portable scanner and clipboard in hand, checking cargo manifests against inventory stacks. The flight crews barely looked up when she passed, and the cadets who did glance her way quickly dismissed her presence. She was the quiet civilian who handled equipment deliveries and wiped down simulator pods. No one asked her name. No one knew that she carried high-level certifications in systems evaluation for combat load transport aircraft. The systems error that routed her to Falcon Crest was a classified misfile someone in Joint Command had sealed. Her reassignment under a vague placeholder code. She had chosen not to fight it. There were things she could learn here, even in the shadows. During simulator drills, she stood behind the observation glass, invisible. The pilots inside called out commands, toggled settings, and sometimes failed critical thresholds without realizing anyone had noticed. Sarah noticed. She kept her black notebook tucked into the inside flap of her uniform, its pages filled with columns of handwritten data, thrust-to-weight ratios, tank offset compensation tables, thermal fluctuation tolerances under overland transport conditions. She never took notes during active hours. Only after lights dimmed and hallways cleared did she sit in the corner of the mechanics bay and write. Her fingers moving with quiet certainty, each number committed from memory after hours of silent observation. The isolation deepened. In the cafeteria, her tray was always the same: a plain protein pack, rehydrated greens, a metal bottle of water. She sat at the end of the longest table, the one no one else used. Trainees streamed past her like she didn't exist, sometimes dropping half-formed jokes loud enough for her to hear. "Logistics, Barbie," someone whispered one day. Another time, "Pretty sure she thinks she's a drone tech in disguise." She never looked up. The food sat untouched half the time, but she stayed until the room cleared. Then she returned to her notes, her hands steady, her mind sharper than ever. Her bunk was at the far end of the unassigned wing. She had no roommate. The sheets were always taut, the locker perfectly organized. A map of the base taped inside the door was marked with highlighter strokes, maintenance corridors, observation angles, venting access points. She traced her own routes each night, planning the next day's path through Falcon Crest with the kind of precision no one had ever asked of her. She wasn't there to belong. She was there to understand. On clear evenings after the base fell into hush, Sarah walked the perimeter paths alone. The desert winds moved across the open runway, brushing sand over the concrete. The C-130 parked in the auxiliary bay always caught her eye, Its massive frame loomed like a crouched animal, heavy, scarred, capable. The others barely noticed it, too focused on their jets and simulators. But Sarah understood the weight that aircraft could carry. She had flown its sisters in live tests before the Falcon Crest trainees had even stepped into their first suits. She could list its backup controls from memory, detail its behavior under uneven weight distributions, and troubleshoot its outdated pressure valves with her eyes closed. But no one had asked, so she never offered. The notebook grew thicker. Its pages held more than figures. They held her understanding of the flaws she saw in Falcon Crest's polished illusion, recruits who skipped pre-flight checklists, cadets who fumbled torque settings mid-simulation, instructors who preached precision, but failed to log system redundancies. She watched it all, wrote it all, not as proof, but as preparation. When Derek Ryan passed her in the maintenance tunnel one morning, he gave her a mocking salute and said, "Still delivering nuts and bolts? Guess someone's got to keep the machines pretty." She didn't respond, just stepped aside, kept moving. He laughed as he walked away, but the sound barely touched her anymore. His words weighed less than the clipboard in her hands. There were moments, late at night, when Sarah sat near the edge of the tarmac with her back against a power unit casing and her boots planted in desert dust. The stars stretched wide overhead, and the long silhouette of the C-130 cast a shadow across the hangar wall. She sometimes reached into her pocket, brushed the edge of the notebook, and closed her eyes. There was no pride in her silence, only purpose. The others didn't need to know what she was. Not yet. She waited. She watched. And every hour she remained. At Falcon Crest, the imbalance between who she was and what they believed her to be grew sharper. But Sarah didn't reach for justice. She reached for readiness, and she was almost there. The emergency alarm began as a low-frequency pulse, dull and rhythmic, like a second heartbeat vibrating through the base walls. Within 30 seconds, it shifted into a full siren, flashing crimson light across every surface of Falcon Crest's logistics bay. Voices barked through comms, personnel scrambled through corridors. Somewhere in the background, a maintenance vehicle swerved into a barricade and shattered its front light. The storm was coming in fast, but that wasn't what triggered the alarm. 2 stripped-down M1 Abrams tanks had already been loaded into the rear hold of the C-130, their bulk anchored by steel harnesses and rubber shock platforms. This wasn't a drill. The tanks were needed at a forward staging zone near the southern ridge, where an Allied Joint Operations Group was being pushed into collapse by an unexpected armored assault. The window to deliver reinforcements was just under an hour. Beyond that, satellite cover would fail, and the transport path would vanish beneath a hostile corridor of heat signatures and dust. Initially, the mood at the command post was tense but measured. That changed in an instant. The 2 assigned C-130 pilots, both seasoned heavy airframe specialists, collapsed in the hangar minutes apart. First came dizziness, then muscle spasms, then slurred speech. Medics rushed them away on stretchers. Word spread fast. A miscalibrated radiation detector embedded in the maintenance scanner had exposed them to a localized leak during pre-checks. Nothing lethal, but enough to incapacitate. The room spun into chaos. "We've got 42 minutes, the logistics chief shouted over the noise. 42 until that forward unit gets flanked without cover. Where are the backup pilots? They're en route from High Bay Air Command. Hours out, someone replied. What about instructors? Another asked. None cleared for combat-loaded deployment in this frame, not under storm crosswind conditions. The sandstorm had already reached the outer perimeter. Radar screens flashed with interference. Wind gust readings doubled. A junior officer pulled up the emergency deployment chart and frowned. "We don't have anyone else rated for heavy torque manual lift under weather." "Ryan!" the base commander called out, spinning toward the cadets who had assembled in the adjacent hangar. Derek Ryan stood, with his flight jacket half-zipped and hands on his hips. He shook his head. "With respect, sir, I've logged 13 hours in the sim with a clean load. Not 2 tanks, that's suicide in this weather." The other cadets exchanged glances but stayed silent. One murmured, "We weren't trained for that kind
of lift. It's out of spec. So no one's taking the mission?"
the commander said, his voice dry. No one answered. The red emergency lights continued to strobe across the operations center. Monitors flickered with warning codes. Someone knocked over a water container near the radio bank. Engineers in jumpsuits surrounded the C-130, yelling about static discharge near the rear axles and unstable ramp hydraulics. The storm pressed against the base like a rising tide. In the midst of the noise, Sarah Mitchell stood near a utility stack behind the main briefing table. No one had noticed her arrive. She wasn't part of the call-out roster, hadn't received the emergency code, but she was already there when the first siren sounded. She stood with her arms folded, eyes scanning the live feed on the largest screen. Fuel flow rates, cargo balance warnings, tail pitch drift. She could read the overload variables at a glance. Every line of code on the display whispered something familiar. Still she didn't move. The commander paced a circle near the center of the room. "If this flight doesn't go out, that ridge unit collapses. We lose 20 armored personnel minimum. That's not theoretical." One of the technicians slammed a manual on the table. "We don't even have a ground taxi override ready. The tank harnesses, we're pre-locked. It'll take 20 to unload. Then they're going," another officer snapped. "If that bomber isn't airborne in 29 minutes, we're calling in an evac instead. We'll be too late." And still, no pilot stepped forward. Derek Ryan stood near the door, jaw tight. His classmates shifted in place. The room reeked of sweat, burnt coffee, and metallic stress. No one wanted to say it aloud, but it was clear. They had the uniforms, the ranks, the reputations, but none of them could fly that mission. Not now, not in that aircraft, not in that storm. Sarah watched it unfold with a stillness that stood apart from the frenzy. She could see the fracture lines forming between authority and action, between pressure and pride. The storm outside wasn't the only one building. 27 minutes remained. The screen showed cargo sway margins falling out of tolerance. The aircraft system began recalculating safe lift parameters and came up red. From the maintenance bay, the sound of shifting wind howled through the pressure vents. Inside the room, silence settled like a held breath. Then someone said aloud what everyone already knew. "We've got no one left." Sarah Mitchell didn't speak. Not yet. But her gaze locked onto the screen again, and her hand, calm, sure, closed over the edge of her notebook. The decision was already forming. She wasn't ready to announce it, not yet, but the moment was coming. The room was a spiral of noise, the kind that comes not from shouting, but from urgency without direction. Alarms throbbed against the walls in low, regular pulses. Commanders paced, trainees fidgeted. The screen at the center of mission control flashed another red alert. Wind velocity surging, tank load offset out of tolerance, estimated failure. To launch, window dropping, under 20 minutes. Voices overlapped, flaring with frustration.
"There's no one else cleared on that frame." "She's too heavy in the rear axle without a rebalancing trim. We'll lose lift by the ridge. If we can't send her up now, we scrap the tanks, cut the load, then, cutting through it all like a softie."
Chime in a riot came 5 words. I can fly it. Heads turned toward the sound. The room paused, not silent, but stunned. Sarah Mitchell stood near the rear bulkhead, just inside the threshold, where the last few officers had rushed in. She didn't shout, she didn't raise a hand. She simply said it again, I can fly it. There was a beat before the first laugh, then a few more, a ripple of open derision. One cadet near the console barked out, Do you even know which end lifts?
Off? Another shook his head and muttered, Guess janitor wings are a thing now.
Sarah didn't blink. Her voice was steady, firm, but almost casual. You've got a malfunction at 19 Delta, right rear ramp seal. If it fails in flight, you'll lose all balance above 200 knots. The tanks need to be reverse harnessed and cross-weighted. Manual ballast trim can offset the differential, but only if you adjust it mid-air. Your rear load sway ratios are already 2 points outside the safe arc. Silence returned. True, thick silence. A junior technician, pale and fast-moving, flipped open a console panel and began typing. His screen lit up slowly, his brows lifted. She's right, he said quietly. Everything she said is correct. The base commander, still flushed from shouting, turned fully toward her. Who the hell are you? Sarah Mitchell, she said. Field evaluation certification, Tier 9, heavy frame transport, cleared under Ops Directive Delta 6. The commander stared, then blinked. Someone whispered, That's a combat-level clearance. Another voice further back said, That's black-filed. An aide leaned into the commander. There's no mission record, no entry file, but the clearance checks out. His voice dropped. Sir, we have no one else. The commander exhaled like someone stepping out of a dream. He gave the smallest nod. You've got 19 minutes. Sarah gave a single nod in return and walked toward the prep corridor without another word. No dramatic pause, no satisfaction, just purpose. Sarah stopped at the gear rack, selected a pressure suit, and pulled it over her uniform with practiced ease. No one moved to help her, no one dared stop her. Outside, the wind howled louder. The edge of the storm reached the far fence line, turning the sky to iron. She climbed into the C-130 alone, ran her checks manually, no support crew, no assistant, just her, inside a steel behemoth loaded to its limit. The engines spun up, turbines.
Roaring louder than the storm, the aircraft crawled from the hangar mouth like a giant coming to life. The takeoff was at the edge of tolerance. Crosswinds struck from the northeast, forcing her to feather the rudder as the aircraft tilted.
She corrected with minimal input, coaxing the frame straight. At 140 knots, she pulled back. The C-130 lifted off. Every part of the climb was a battle against physics and weather, but she held it steady. 32 minutes later, she touched. Down at the forward operations zone, tanks delivered, mission complete, not a bolt out of place. When she returned to Falcon Crest, a quiet crowd had gathered along the tarmac. Instructors, trainees, officers in wind-swept caps. No one spoke. They watched the bird return, not with fanfare, but with gravity. Sarah stepped down alone, her boots meeting the tarmac with soft, grounded weight. The base commander stepped out to meet her, his cap tucked under his arm, his eyes rimmed with something between regret and reverence. He stood tall, then raised his hand in a crisp salute. "We misjudged you," he said. Sarah didn't reply. A few steps behind the commander, Derek Ryan shifted awkwardly. He opened his mouth, then closed it.
Again.
Finally, he took a half step forward. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." Sarah met his gaze. Her face didn't harden, didn't soften. She simply looked at him, 1 second, 2, then she walked past him without a word. The weight of That silence hit harder than anything else could have. The other cadets straightened. One by one, they fell into a line. No order was given, no command issued. They just moved, shoulders square, feet aligned, back stiff in the wind. Derek joined them. So did the instructors, the crew chiefs, even the senior officers. They stood there in formation, not for a medal, not for a speech, but because she had made them see. Sarah walked the line, boots echoing across the strip. She met each pair of eyes in turn. There was nothing in her face except calm. No satisfaction, no
anger.
Only something deeper, an understanding they would have to live with. At the end of the row, someone asked the question that had lingered since dawn. "Will you stay? Lead here?" Sarah paused. "I wasn't meant to be here," she said, her voice low, but steady. "But maybe now, someone like me will be." She turned without waiting for a response and stepped off the runway into the soft dust that trailed the dying storm. Her figure grew smaller with every step. No one followed, no one dared. Behind her, the line remained unbroken, held in place not by command, but by consequence. And in her absence, everything began to shift. Before first light, she was gone. But the change she left behind took root and grew, in new protocols, in open doors, in the quiet understanding that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just flies. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.